Michael, this is an excellent film.
Thank you.
And it's your first feature. That's absolutely wild.
It's my first feature, yeah.
I have cards, so I'm going to be reading from these. 'Cause a lady comes prepared. So I would love to hear from you, like, where this story came from and what was the process of getting it from script to screen.
I do a lot of yoga. It's a funny response, but yoga is like an incredible process that is about flexibility. It's about flowing. It's about being in uncomfortable situations and being comfortable. And it's it's an interesting metaphor for the way you described the film, which was really, really beautiful. The film came about the story came about when I arrived to Buenos Aires. I studied art in the art school there for a couple of years, and I remember seeing signs around the city, kind of like buitre, like vultures. And there was an anti-US campaign happening at the time from the super leftist government that they had. And actually, the first week when I arrived, I got into a taxi, and the guy's like, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from America." And he's like, "Oh, me too." And I said, "Oh, cool. Like, which part? Like Florida?" He's like, "No, I'm from Argentina." And I totally didn't understand what he meant, and then I learned that America is actually a continent in Argentina. It's not a country. I was kind of arrested by his response, and how do I say myself in English then? Am I North American? No. And then in Spanish they say estadounidense, meaning like United States, and there's actually a noun to describe your nationality, which is convenient, right? If you're a French person talking to an Italian, you're not going to say like I'm European, and the French person is, the Italian would be like, well, me too. And yet we do that, right? We do that when we travel, and there's no noun for us, but it's not our fault. It's not our fault. Like the language colonialism is not the individual citizens aren't responsible for that, but we do have consequences. People think maybe we're ignorant or stupid or naive. Those are the stereotypes of being a U.S. citizen in another country. And you really feel that if you live in another country, not only if you spend a weekend or a week there, and if you fall in love with somebody, and if you really get involved emotionally with the country. So in 2012, there was like a major campaign happening kind of about like the Argentine economic crisis. And I remember seeing signs everywhere, and I learned about this concept of vulture financing, vulture funds. And I found that there were certain US-based financiers that would collapse the Argentine economy. And I ended up visiting the Museum of the Memory in Argentina, the Museo de la Memoria. And I learned about the state terrorism that happened there in 1970s and 80s. And then, of course, you read into it. And United States didn't really recognize that until 2016, Obama 2015, and then in Trump, in fact, 2019, they started to declassify CIA documents. So in 2020, when I wrote the script, I was reading some of these, everybody's in the pandemic. I actually wrote the script in pandemic and a lot of free time, and I did a lot of research in the dark web of the CIA. And they recognize all of these crimes essentially, and the financing of the terrorism. And obviously, if you do more research about Panama, the School of the Americas, the Chicago Boys, we know of Pinochet in the United States, but Videla, the president of Argentina at that time, who became a dictator, was also trained in Panama by the U.S. government and Henry Kissinger. So we learn a little bit about these things that they will call you a Yankee in Argentina. And you're like, well, I've never heard of that term before.
I thought it was interesting that your character never got a name. Like he was known as Yankee. It became his identity.
Yeah, that is kind of a derogatory term in Argentina, depending on the context. They've developed a name, a noun for our nationality because we don't have one, right? That makes sense to Latin American people. So I think like as a first kind of culture shock, it brought me into awareness, and I wanted to make my first film in Argentina because I love the culture so much, and because of what they taught me in that time period when I arrived as a backpacker, because that part is kind of real, and I discovered interesting art community for some reason in California, I felt very guilty painting, let's say, or even in New York. It's like, I'm just painting and I'm paying $1,500 a month rent. And, as an artist, you're going to study painting, or you're going to study finance, or you're going to study law, and you pay the same tuition in the university, right? It doesn't make sense. You've got all this debt, and you're going to take all this debt to study painting. And as an industry, the art industry is complicated. And so in Argentina, when I arrived there, I got to study for free, actually. The art school was free. It was a state university. And so I learned about, another mode of social organization, like socialism and peronismo. And I never heard of that, growing up in Northern California. I'm like, well, are these just commies, these like, and it's because we have this pretty intense bias through our capitalist bias. So all of that, I think, and kind of the story was a culmination of many of these things, finding all of this free time during the pandemic when I was stuck there.
Great. So much to unpack. That was a great explanation. About making this film in Argentina, I was curious about that because you're from Northern California. So many American independent filmmakers have a hard time getting their films financed, getting our films made here, because we don't have the cultural support, right? And we sort of dream about being from abroad. So, it's much easier it seems to make small personal films if you live in a foreign country. So the question is...
I can even speak to that.
Yeah.
I mean,
go ahead.
Just like making it's true. Like just like Argentina, France. I mean, you've been through Europe. I don't know if you've lived there, but they have a system. They had a system of financing, and it was connected to their socialist social system. They finance films, and they finance probably 200 a year. In fact, the trailer that you saw before my film is another Argentine film called El Jockey, and that was also part. They gave me $300,000 for the film, and then when you have a couple stars, there's actually 3 big stars in the film, and as you know, working with stars, it creates as much as possible this concept of being able to sell, through names, through followers, and that really helps then to get other investors interested.
Was you being an American a problem to get the financing from Argentina?
Oh, that's also really an interesting question. I don't think it was a problem because of the subject matter. It's crazy. I mean, my Argentine friends are kind of almost as nervous as I am when I'm showing the film in the United States, right? They're like, well, we're here, we are vindicated, and there, you're you're kind of a persecutor. You're a perpetrator, right? As audience members watching this film, we're all kind of guilty of being U.S. citizens and guilty of having the stereotypes, let's say, associated with that, the archetypes, but the idea of ignorance, of being, the stupid American. And that's something that, going back to the question of fluidity, I think unites us all in the film. In the U.S., we often talk about, like you said, gender identity, racial identity, sexual identity, but we don't talk about national identity. And, what does it mean to be a U.S. citizen? I mean, sure, it happened 2 days ago, right? The 4th of July, but is it just like, hamburgers and, barbecues at the beach and beer? No, I mean, so when you go abroad, then you get a perspective on what that means to other people.
And now more than ever, you're living the American dream of getting out of America.
Yeah,
you're sort of ahead of the curve.
That's funny, yeah. I guess like the American dream now of getting out of the country, that would be a crazy, I think that, so my friend, people are like, well, how did they react in the U.S.? Everybody's always asking me because they're all really sensitive. I mean, these are, and obviously I would be like, well, these are predator politicians, and the people that watch the film aren't the predator politicians that are making the decisions to collapse third world countries and plant dictators, and I think the people that end up watching the film are generally very open-minded, very curious about the world, obviously diverse group of people. So it's not like necessarily the target audience. The interesting thing is that we were invited to the U.S. I invited the U.S. ambassador to Argentina to the film in Buenos Aires.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and He didn't come, but he sent his cultural minister there, and she came, and there was like 650 people. It was the opening screening in the theatrical release, and she was like, I mean, for whatever reason, she introduced me to like a couple of the ambassador's friends came, and and I was like, "Did you see the trailer?" Because where the ambassadors kind of like hang, or Henry Kissinger and that stuff, and then it turned out that the ambassador told NPR, the NPR representative who came to interview Milei, the Argentine president, about me, about the film. It's like, you should interview this filmmaker. So I was interviewed by an NPR representative of Latin America, and then also he mentioned, I mean, it's crazy, right? And he never even see the film, but he mentioned the film to the Argentine ambassador in Washington, D.C., and so they invited me to show the film in Washington, D.C. in the Argentine Embassy of the United States.
What?
So that's when you think about like making change, right? Like that's when this idea of like bridging gaps of difference.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's kind of when it happens.
You are acting with movie stars from Argentina.
Yeah.
And you're holding your own against them completely. I mean, can we have a round of applause for this performance in this film?
Indeed.
So this is your first time on camera.
Yeah.
You're directing this film. You've written this film. You're starring in the movie. Your performance is so organic. You seem like a natural on screen.
Thank you.
How did that happen?
Fuck.
And that's a crazy question.
Yeah. No, thank you so much.
You tortured yourself.
Yeah. That's the line in the movie, right?
Yes.
You got it. You got it, Jess. That scene was really hard. And I mean, there's so many of my really close people here, and it's really emotional for me to be here. I was actually kind of stuck during the pandemic, and the difficult part of that was my mom was in California, and I spent 2.5 years without seeing her, and that was the longest time that happened, and so. The scene where I am hanging myself, I was just looking at a photo of my mom because I didn't know how long it was going to be to when I would see her again. And I think that there's something about the inhibitions of living in another country and how I think you are able to flow. I think you pointed out that in the first comment you made, and there's something about not having this pressure of being yourself or what you think yourself is supposed to be like. And I think the concept, kind of the deeper questions of the film have to do with acting. What does acting mean? And I think that acting is an incredibly sacred space where you get to test out your identity. You get to be a different gender, a different sexuality, a different nationality, a different profession, and that kind of massaging of yourself, maybe molding of yourself, becomes more present during an acting workshop, let's say, and so I think that I mean, I never acted before, and didn't write the script, think I was going to act, and during the pandemic, there was no U.S. actors in Argentina, and the airports were closed, so I couldn't bring any U.S. actors into the country, and so I had to read the lines during the auditions for the main cast, and I was reading the U.S. character because there wasn't really anybody else. We tried to cast for U.S. people, there was nobody in the country, and then the actors were like, well, "We think you should do it," and I was like, "Me?" And they said, yeah, you'd be really good. And then I talked to my producers, and they were like, well, we think you're good in Spanish, but not in English. And I'm like, well, there's 90% in Spanish. And they're like, yeah, that's true.
And you mentioned earlier, when you speak Spanish, you feel like you're playing a part. Or you're performing.
Totally. I mean, and there's a lot of corollaries, right? The idea of reading a script and reading words that you're learning, like where the bathroom is, and just something simple like that, right? Like you learn language and you're You're trying to understand the language by reading a dictionary. That's how I learned Spanish, literally. Like I would just like write words down on paper and I would memorize them, and then I would go, outside, and then I would have to speak that in when you fall in love with somebody, or when you're in some sort of work environment where there's pressure and you're like, shit, what is that word? And it becomes like a survival need instead of a classroom assignment.
Wow, it's just an incredible performance.
Thank you.
So theater, performance, acting, you just spoke about how these are explored in the film in many ways. Dante has a line where he says the only way to not live in the past is by acting, by being in the present. Right?
Totally.
Can you talk about how performance is explored in the film as well? And Dante's line, if you want.
That's such a great. I love how meticulous you observe the film, and it's really beautiful. That line, and I think just the idea of a temporary autonomous zone, which is a concept by Hakim Bey, which I read this book from this New York City queer author, kind of taboo a little bit. I don't know if you know of him. He also wrote this book called Pirate Utopias. And in the book of temporary autonomous zones, kind of like Mark Fisher, his concept of acid communism, this idea that we don't really know how to create a better society because we're stuck in who we are too much. We're stuck in patterns. We're stuck in our notion of self, in our presentation of self, in the way we dress, in the way we present ourselves. So in order to get away from that, acting, and for Mark Fisher, acid, LSD was one way to reimagine a space. But I think also this idea of temporary autonomous zones, it's also connected to like being outside of the law, like finding places that exist outside of like even just not just personal deconstructions of self, but legal freedom. Like where can you be free? Because speaking of contradictions, right? There's a manifesto in the film. It's bajonaranja.com. It's a manifesto that I wrote, and the first line is, as a society, we often legalize our perversions and punish what heals us. And I think like if you think about like the history of slavery, for example, like that was legal, but homosexuality was illegal, domestic abuse towards a woman was legal, but you couldn't smoke marijuana, right? And you think about the contradictions that we exist for thousands of years in our society until one day we wake up and we're like, oh shit, that's probably immoral. And so how do we get out of that mindset even, right? And liberate ourselves. So this concept of temporary autonomous zones, I think, is interesting because they're kind of spaces of liberation. And how and where do we find those in our daily life? Like where do you push yourself to find, to test, to understand, to explore parts of who you are? Why do you, where do you experience that, and how necessary is that, especially for art, I think. And so as a kind of a circuitous answer, the question of the line of Dante, the being present and acting, I think that's where it comes from.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I love that the film embraces the outlaw nature of queerness. That whole notion of be gay, do crime.
Yes.
With them robbing a bank to finance their show. But then the film also has this 60s free love spiritual modality, And then, so when Goya, who's sort of genderqueer, right?
Yeah.
Expresses their dislike of...
And also non-binary.
Non-binary, yeah. When they express their dislike of the Yankee, and the friends have them enter the circle and stare into each other's eyes, and they sort of cry and embrace. Can you talk about how these modalities coexist for you? I feel like that's part of what sets you apart as a filmmaker.
Thank you. I was reading this amazing book I recommend to everybody called Ethical Slut.
Yes.
Yes. It's a great book, and I think it has its problems, but
For sure.
But as a foundation for openness in relationships, polyamory, it taught me a lot. It gave me an understanding of a new way of being. The idea that maybe polyamory is an identity, is an orientation. It's not like a lifestyle. Like, I think a lot of people categorize it. They think it's like a swingers club, or they think it's like golf or something. You just do it sometimes. It's not like part of you. And I think, so that scene where they're connecting, there is, I believe, a concept that she spoke about called wargasms in the book. And it's this notion of being open and honest and communicate how you feel in the polycule, in the group, even if that is causes of war, of anger, of fighting, and how connected those energies are, like this anger with the libido, and I think that also the question of acting, right? Like the gaze, how actors connect. If you've ever taken an acting workshop, oftentimes they have you warm up and look at each other in the eye, right? And so that kind of concept, I think, of like this group of actors that are kind of confusing different things, but are also exploring things. I think that's where it originated.
Wow. Okay. The polyamory in this feels. I can't speak to being part of the culture.
Yeah.
Yet, but
That's right.
it just felt so authentic, so lived in, and so natural. So I really applaud you on that depiction of that lifestyle.
Thank you. The notion of, I think there's not a lot of representation of polyamory in films. I can only name one that is not about a monogamous relationship opening it up to a third.
Yeah.
And so they do that usually as a band-aid, and like 95% fail because of that.
That's right.
And so people think of polyamory as this thing that kind of you can do if your monogamy is failing. And to me, what I've discovered in my own experience with monogamy and not being able to function within that romantic system is just that. It's not, obviously it's not a band-aid to cure anything. It's this notion where how can I control like love? How can I, it's very simple in that sense. Like I can't put like a wall around my partner and say, you're never gonna fall in love with anybody. But we do that, right? We live in these like romanticist ideals. But it's not, so first of all, it's like I'm entering into this relationship. If I'm in a monogamous, usually in my experience, it's like, then it's this kind of, it's almost like they say in cinema, the willful suspension of disbelief, right? Where you're kind of pretending that I'm gonna never fall in love with anybody else during the time you're doing that. And in my experience, it's never happened where I could sustain that for several years, but I'm supposed to pretend that. So I think at the beginning, it's this recognition that's not the pattern that we are agreeing upon, or that's been a part of our experience. And it's opening up to this new concept of communication, of that, love is not a possession. You can't possess love. It's not even something that really you can choose. At least I don't believe it is. I don't think love is something you can't just be like, I want to love you, and then I'm gonna fall in love with you, and it happens. It's almost destiny, right? It's almost like something that is exterior to our willpower. It chooses us. And it brings us together. So how can I, who am I to try to force that into a monogamous kind of situation? And so I think for me, this film was a doorway, you could say, to explore this new style of love that I had never experienced before this. In 2019, I think I had ended my last monogamous relationship. And so then I was like, fuck, this is always happening. Like, how many books can I read about this? And then you realize it's so hard to download or to manifest the theory into practice, because it's messy and there's a lot of insecurities, right? And you have to be willing to talk about those insecurities a lot. And I think that's the work. I think that's the most important work that we can do as human beings.
Yes.
Because if we can overcome and reach self-love and overcome our insecurities, I don't think we're going to have vulture financiers trying to collapse third world countries, and something so small as I think people will be happier.
Yes.
So it's a philosophy that has become very much a way, like my my militancy, you could say.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
The visual aesthetic of this film is just incredible.
Well, your films are very colorful.
Thank you. So I appreciate your use of color and fashion and production design. And I would say it's almost as if the fashion and the design make just as much of a political statement as the commentary on Kissinger and the injustice that's explored in the film. And I read that you started off as a visual artist before you were a filmmaker. So can you talk about your process and how you created the film's look and feel?
Yeah, thanks. That's really nice. Let's see. I love to paint, and I love to look at paintings, go to museums, and watch films and think about compositions. And I'm kind of like a freak in that sense. And I guess I started out using lookbooks and thinking of the world that I wanted to create. And we did a proof of concept, which was extremely useful. You probably know, Bruce was like, I don't do that. Bruce LaBruce, I was with Bruce LaBruce, who's this amazing filmmaker, a couple weeks ago. And I was like, have you ever done it? He's like, never. And he's made like 13 features. But I was like so fortunate to have the chance to do that, because that gave me an opportunity to test, just like you said, the makeup, the wardrobe, the lights, and I made a lot of changes as a result of that. The pastels, the proof of concept is on our Instagram, and it's really darker. It's more punk, like it's less like queercore. It's and so I think that also I did a session of photos, and with anything, I think that like most things become real through contrast. Yeah. I think we don't know really, what something is, if it's an ice cream, if it's whatever, if it's a color, if it's an image, you have to contrast it with something else. I mean, that's the beauty of cinema, is you have just a series of thousands of images, individual images juxtaposed. And I think that when you have the opportunity to test out things, you get to really understand what you're trying to say and you reflect on it. So my process was I had a day to do a photo shoot with the actors and the crew. I had 2 days of a proof of concept video filming, which was super useful. And then, going to museums, making detailed mood boards that, exploring kind of like, well, what does punk and naive mean? Like, how do you unite those two opposites? Because I believe that paradox, contradiction is a really fascinating and a beautiful experience when you mash things together and a new form arises that seem to be contradictory. And in fact, that was the logline for the film for a minute. It was like a naive punk naive film, until we changed it to a genre fluid film, which I like better. Yeah.
I love the moment when Dante is putting the lipstick on your character before you go to the American Embassy.
Yeah.
He's not using the lipstick, he's using his finger.
So true.
And the specificity of that was just it created more tenderness.
I love that.
There's a subtlety to it, but you can still see the lipstick on camera, which I loved. So I'm not sure if this is the right read, but the film seems to become more surreal and fantastical as it progresses.
Yeah.
And by the end, we're at a party, or a spectacle as you call it, that feels out of Weimar, like a modern version of Weimar Berlin.
I love it.
And
Yeah.
our main characters are putting on a play that they haven't rehearsed. I tend to think it's metaphor, and that it's just become, the lines between performance and reality have become blurred at the end. I'd love to hear you speak about what your intentions were.
There's a moment where the Yankee character falls, he hits his head. That could be a dream sequence. The rest of the film, the characters start to slowly reappear, and then they culminate in the brothel scene. And the brothel scene, to me, and this is where translating into another language is challenging, because Argentina has this amazing expression which is called la concha de la lora. If anybody speaks Spanish, they know how crazy that expression is, because like literally it means like the vagina of a parrot, and you can't really translate that into English. It's really weird, and it means but imagine like all the scenes that like the vagina of a parrot, like don't do that, and it kind of means like Timbuktu in some ways. It also means like fucking shit. It also means like god, there's a lot of like idiosyncrasies to that term, and the history of that term is fascinating, which is where the origin of tango is supposed to come from, which is like kind of brothels where men would dance who were Marines. Kind of sailors and Marines and pirates. They would dance in brothels on the port. And I read this history of the term la concha de la lora, like a parrot, right? So I tried to create an analogy for that and reproduce the kind of the mythology of the term that the Argentines use, which is that it was actually, they called the prostitutes parrots because they spoke different language. So in the brothels, they would speak like French and Polish and Hebrew, actually. And they, during that time in 1900. And so the neighborhood they called them like the vagina of the parrots, meaning like the prostitutes who were there. And so the term became this kind of like surreal, weird, like there's a parrot on a bed, and yet there's a subtext to that. So the rich subtext you could kind of understand if you study the origin of that term, but it's even harder if you speak English, because then you don't even realize that it's a phrase. Like we would say Timbuktu. If somebody who didn't speak English heard you say Timbuktu, they'd be like, what the hell does that mean? That's like a place in like Mali or something. And so I think that the surrealist element could be potentially justified in the fact that he falls and hits his head, but then it's also of this kind of rich tapestry for the subtext of this bizarre expression in Spanish, in Argentine Spanish.
The film is dedicated to your mother, who's here tonight.
Yes, my mom.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for this excellent film.
Thank you so much, Darren, for being here. Thank you.